I came home from a 3-day business trip expecting the same thing I had left behind: a quiet townhouse, a peaceful backyard, and the familiar feeling that comes from living somewhere long enough that every crack in the pavement feels like part of your story. Instead, before I even unlocked my back door, I heard a low mechanical hum vibrating through the walls. At first I thought maybe a utility company was working nearby, but when I stepped into my kitchen and felt a faint tremor under my feet, I knew something wasn't right. The sound wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from my backyard. And when I slid open the glass door and walked outside, I just stood there staring. Bolted directly onto the dividing wall between my property and the neighboring unit was a massive gray pool pump enclosure, almost as large as a washing machine. Thick blue pipes disappeared into freshly dug trenches leading toward a brand-new swimming pool next door. The machine vibrated continuously, sending a subtle but constant shudder through the wall itself. My wall. The wall that had been standing there since 1984. The wall my late father had helped maintain for decades. The wall that separated my little piece of peace from the rest of the world. I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because sometimes when something is so ridiculous, your brain doesn't know what else to do. I walked closer, ran my hand over the concrete, and felt the vibration. Whoever installed this thing hadn't just crossed a line. They had literally drilled through it. To understand why that hit me so hard, you need to understand what that property meant to me. My townhouse sat at the end of a 4-unit row in a small community outside Columbus. Nothing fancy, just solid concrete construction, narrow backyards, and neighbors who mostly minded their own business. The backyard stretched maybe 25 feet from the sliding door to the rear fence. Half of it was covered in old terracotta tiles my father had installed himself years before he passed away. Every time I stepped outside, I saw those tiles and remembered weekends spent working beside him. He wasn't a man who talked much about feelings, but he believed deeply in respecting what belonged to other people. He used to say, "You don't have to love your neighbor, but you better respect their fence line." Funny how that came back to me later. The new neighbors had moved in about 2 months earlier. Their names were Travis and Melissa. They were the kind of couple who arrived with expensive SUVs, matching patio furniture, and endless renovation plans. Before they even unpacked completely, contractors started showing up almost every day. New landscaping, new lighting, new deck, new fencing. Everything had to be upgraded. Travis especially seemed to enjoy letting everyone know he considered himself an expert. He ran some kind of residential consulting business, though from what I could tell, most of his job involved telling other people how they should improve their properties. The first real conversation we had happened the day they moved in. I was watering flowers near the fence when he leaned over and said, "We're going to transform this place. You'll barely recognize it in 6 months." I smiled politely and said, "As long as everybody stays on their own side of the property line, I don't care what you do." He laughed, not a friendly laugh, more like the kind people give when they think they've spotted someone naive. Then he said something I never forgot. "Property lines are mostly suggestions anyway." I remember looking at him for a second, wondering if he was joking. He wasn't. Looking back now, that was probably the first warning sign. Over the following weeks, there were little things. Construction materials stacked partially against the shared wall. Workers walking through areas they shouldn't. Loud music during projects. Nothing major by itself, but enough to create a pattern. Every time I'd politely mention something, Travis would wave it off. "No big deal." That became his favorite phrase. No big deal. The problem with people who say that is they're usually talking about problems they're creating for someone else. So standing there in my backyard staring at that pool equipment mounted directly onto my wall, I already knew exactly how the conversation was going to go. I knocked on their door. Travis answered wearing sunglasses, even though he was standing inside his own house. Behind him, I could see workers moving around near the new pool. "What's up?" he asked. I pointed toward the wall. "You attached a pool pump to my property." He glanced past me and shrugged. "Oh, that. The installer recommended it. Your wall is stronger." "It's not your wall." "Relax," he said. "You'll get used to it." I still remember how casually he said it. Like he was discussing a flower pot instead of mechanical equipment bolted into someone else's structure. Then he added, "Honestly, you're the only person who would even notice." Maybe he expected me to start yelling. Maybe he wanted an argument. Instead, I nodded. "Got it." His smile widened. He thought the conversation was over. What he didn't realize was that I had just decided not to fight him emotionally. I was going to fight him professionally. Because people like Travis spend their whole lives preparing for arguments. They rarely prepare for documentation. That evening I pulled every property record I owned from a filing cabinet in my office. Survey maps, construction documents, original subdivision records, shared wall agreements. Then I started making phone calls. And that was the moment this stopped being a neighbor dispute and started becoming something much bigger. The next morning I started doing something Travis never expected me to do. I stopped talking and started collecting evidence. Most neighborhood disputes burn themselves out because both sides get emotional, start shouting, make threats, and eventually somebody backs down. I wasn't interested in any of that. I wanted facts. I wanted records. I wanted a paper trail so clean that nobody could argue with it later. The first call I made was to an independent structural engineer named Raymond Foster. I'd worked with him years earlier during a drainage issue and trusted him because he wasn't the type to exaggerate. If something was a problem, he'd tell you. If it wasn't, he'd tell you that too. 3 days later, he showed up carrying a vibration meter, a clipboard, and the expression of a man who had seen every kind of homeowner disaster imaginable. We spent nearly an hour in the backyard. He measured vibration levels along the wall. He inspected the mounting bolts. He traced the route of the pipes. Every few minutes, he would jot down notes without saying much. Finally, he stepped back and folded his arms. Well, he said, that's creative. I asked him what that meant. He pointed at the equipment. Mechanical equipment attached to a structure that wasn't approved as a support system. Wrong permits. Wrong installation. Wrong location. Then he looked directly at me. And if your property survey is accurate, they're physically attached to your side of the boundary. Hearing a professional say it out loud felt strangely reassuring. Not because I wanted trouble, but because I wanted confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. Sometimes when somebody acts confident enough, you start questioning your own common sense. Travis had that effect on people. He carried himself like a man who assumed every room belonged to him. But confidence isn't evidence. Raymond spent another 30 minutes documenting everything. Before leaving, he handed me a preliminary report. It wasn't dramatic. No emotional language. Just facts. Equipment mounted on a shared boundary structure without authorization. Mechanical vibration transferring into adjacent property. Potential code violations. Possible encroachment. In other words, exactly what I needed. A few days later, I received an email from a law office representing Travis. That surprised me because nobody had even filed a complaint yet. Apparently, he had already decided lawyers would solve the problem. The email was written in the kind of polished language attorneys use when they're trying to make unreasonable behavior sound reasonable. They acknowledged that the installation may have caused minor inconvenience and offered me a $300 gift card to a home improvement store in exchange for signing a liability waiver and agreeing not to pursue future claims regarding the installation. I read that email 3 times because I honestly thought it might be a joke. $300. That's what they believed respect for property rights was worth. Not repairs, not removal, not an apology, just enough money to buy a decent lawnmower. I almost laughed. Instead, I responded with exactly 2 attachments and 1 sentence. The first attachment was Raymond's engineering report. The second was a copy of the property survey. The sentence read, "Please arrange immediate removal pursuant to municipal code requirements and property boundary regulations." That was it. No insults. No threats. No emotional speeches. Just facts. Several days passed. Then another week. The machine kept humming. The vibration continued. Every evening when I sat on my patio, I could hear the constant mechanical drone. Sometimes I'd catch Travis glancing over the fence. He always looked relaxed, almost amused, as if he believed he had already won. One Saturday afternoon, I was outside trimming bushes when he wandered over carrying a drink. "You know," he said casually, "most people would have taken the gift card." I kept trimming. "Most people don't have a pool pump attached to their wall." He smirked. "You really think anybody from the city is going to care?" I looked at him. "We'll find out." He laughed again, that same arrogant laugh from the day he moved in. Then he walked away. The thing about arrogance is that it works surprisingly well until reality arrives with paperwork. 2 weeks later, reality showed up. A city compliance inspector named Karen Delgado scheduled a site visit after reviewing the documents I submitted. She arrived on a Monday morning carrying a tablet, a sound meter, and enough authority to make contractors nervous. Travis happened to be home. I think he assumed he could charm his way through the inspection. The first few minutes actually looked promising for him. He greeted Karen with a smile and immediately launched into an explanation about modern pool systems, construction efficiency, and neighborhood improvements. Karen listened politely, without saying much. Then she started measuring. She checked the equipment location against parcel maps. She reviewed permit records. She measured sound levels. She inspected mounting points. She asked questions nobody had bothered asking before. Who approved the attachment location? Which permit authorized installation on that structure? Was the adjoining property owner notified? Each answer seemed to make Travis slightly less comfortable. The confidence began fading from his face. At one point he actually said, "Everybody does this." Karen didn't even look up from her tablet. "No," she replied. "Everybody does not do this." That might have been my favorite moment of the entire inspection. 10 minutes later she finished documenting everything. Then she turned toward both of us. "This installation is non-compliant." Travis immediately started talking. Karen raised a hand. He stopped. "The equipment exceeds residential noise thresholds and is mounted on a structure located outside the approved installation area. It must be relocated." For the first time since this whole situation began, I saw genuine concern appear on his face. "Relocated where?" he asked. "That's your contractor's problem. How long do we have?" Karen glanced at her notes. 10 days. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over people when they suddenly realize consequences are real. After Karen left, Travis stood in his driveway staring at the inspection notice. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered every dismissive comment, every shrug, every time he treated my concerns like an inconvenience. Respect costs nothing. Disrespect can become very expensive. Over the next several days the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. Contractors returned. Meetings happened. Vehicles came and went. I could hear arguments from their backyard. Melissa looked stressed whenever I saw her. One evening, she actually approached me while collecting mail. "Could this still be worked out somehow?" she asked quietly. I thought about that question for a moment. "It could have been worked out the day I first knocked on your door." She nodded slowly because deep down she knew that was true. The issue had never been the pump. It had never been the noise. It had been the assumption that they could take something that wasn't theirs and simply expect acceptance afterward. As the 10th day approached, rumors started circulating among neighbors. Some believed Travis would somehow get an extension. Others thought he would fight the city. One guy across the street claimed he'd probably sue everybody involved. Maybe Travis believed that too. But regulations don't care how confident you are. Property records don't care how wealthy you are. Survey maps don't care how persuasive your lawyer sounds. And on the morning of day 10, just after sunrise, I looked out my kitchen window and saw a white service truck slowly pulling into their driveway. The countdown had reached 0. I poured myself a cup of coffee and walked out onto the patio just as the crew climbed out of the truck. The air was cool, the neighborhood was quiet, and for the first time in weeks the constant tension felt like it was about to break. 2 technicians rolled equipment carts toward the shared wall while another worker began shutting down the pool system. Nobody was smiling. Nobody was chatting. This wasn't an upgrade anymore. This was a correction. I watched as they disconnected the pipes one section at a time. The machine that had seemed so permanent suddenly looked surprisingly temporary. Funny how that works. The things people force into your life always seem enormous at first, right up until the moment they have to remove them. Travis appeared on his deck carrying a phone. He looked exhausted. Gone was the confident guy who treated property lines like optional suggestions. Gone was the man who laughed at city inspections. What stood there now was somebody doing mental math on a mistake that had become very expensive. The technicians began removing the mounting bolts. One by one they backed out of the wall, leaving behind small holes that would later be patched and refinished. The entire process took less than an hour. Less than an hour to undo a decision that had created months of conflict. As they lifted the pump housing onto a dolly, I felt something I didn't expect. Relief, yes. Satisfaction, absolutely. But also a strange sadness. Not because I felt bad for Travis, but because none of this had ever needed to happen. We could have been neighbors. We could have shared a fence line, exchanged holiday greetings, maybe helped each other during storms or power outages. Instead, pride got involved. Ego got involved. The need to be right became more important than the ability to be reasonable. Around mid-morning, Karen, the compliance inspector, returned for the final verification. She walked directly to the wall, reviewed the repairs, checked photographs against her earlier records, and inspected the fresh stucco patching. Everything was being restored exactly as required. Travis approached her holding a folder full of documents. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I heard enough. He was still arguing, still looking for a technicality, still trying to convince someone that the situation had been blown out of proportion. Finally, Karen closed the folder and handed it back. Then she said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The issue was never complicated. You installed equipment where it didn't belong. The correction is to move it. Simple, direct, impossible to argue with. Travis started to respond, but she cut him off with a look that made it very clear the discussion was over. A few minutes later, she signed the compliance report and prepared to leave. As she walked toward her vehicle, Travis muttered something under his breath about lawyers and lawsuits. Karen stopped, turned around, and calmly said, "You're currently the party found in violation. I'd recommend being careful about who you threaten." Then she got in her vehicle and drove away. And just like that, it was over. The truck left shortly afterward. The workers disappeared. The equipment was gone. For the first time in nearly 2 months, my backyard was silent. Real silence. The kind you don't appreciate until somebody takes it away from you. I sat down in one of the old patio chairs my father used to use and listened. No humming. No vibration. No mechanical drone echoing through the wall. Just birds, distant traffic, and the breeze moving through the trees. I remember running my hand across the repaired section of concrete. If you didn't know what happened, you'd never notice the difference. The wall looked whole again. But I noticed. Because that wall had taught me something. Growing up, I always assumed major conflicts happened because people hated each other. As I've gotten older, I've realized that's rarely true. Most conflicts happen because somebody convinces themselves that rules shouldn't apply to them. They tell themselves they're smarter, busier, more important, more deserving. Eventually, they stop seeing boundaries altogether. Travis didn't install that pump because he needed to. He installed it there because it was easier for him. And somewhere along the way, convenience became more important than respect. That's what this story was really about. Not a pool pump. Not a wall. Not even property lines. It was about respect. The simple act of recognizing that other people have rights that matter just as much as your own. A few weeks later, one of my neighbors asked whether I felt like I had won. I thought about it for a second and honestly said, no. I just refused to lose. Because winning would have been never having the conflict in the first place. Winning would have been a simple conversation ending with, "You're right, we'll move it." Instead, everyone lost time, money, and peace over something completely avoidable. Still, every now and then when I sit in that backyard and enjoy the quiet, I think about the comment Travis made on the day we first met. Property lines are mostly suggestions anyway. Maybe that's true for some people. But in my experience, the moment somebody ignores a boundary, that boundary becomes the most important line on the map. So now I want to hear from you. Was I right to push the issue all the way through official channels? Or should I have accepted the compromise and avoided the fight? Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who believed the rules didn't apply to them? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and honestly, I'm curious where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who understands exactly how valuable a little peace and quiet can be.